On a bitter winter night, deep in the Alaskan wilderness, Warren Pierce sat by the crackling fire, his cabin wrapped in an icy silence. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the wooden walls like a restless ghost. He had lived here for years, accustomed to the solitude, the unrelenting cold, and the wild creatures that lurked beyond the tree line. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to happen. It started with a sound, soft at first, barely audible beneath the roar of the wind. A faint scratching at the door. Warren frowned, setting down his mug of tea, probably a stray dog or a fox, sniffing for scraps. But then came the whining, low, desperate, almost pleading. His pulse quickened. Dogs didn't come out this far. Not alone, not in a storm like this. He reached for his flashlight, hesitated, then stood and approached the door. Through the frost-covered window, he could make out two dark figures huddled just beyond the porch, their shapes barely visible in the swirling snow. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down his spine. Wolves. His grip tightened around the doorknob. Wolves didn't beg. They hunted. They killed. And yet, something about these creatures was different. Their bodies trembled violently, ribs visible beneath matted fur. No snarling, no bared teeth, just two pairs of glowing eyes staring into his cabin like a lifeline. Warren's instincts screamed at him to not open that door. This was madness. But something deeper, something older, whispered back, "Help them." His breath fogged in the cold air as he cracked the door open just an inch. The nearer wolf took a staggering step forward, its legs wobbling. A pitiful sound escaped its throat. A whimper, not a growl, not a threat, not a predator, just desperate. Against every survival instinct, Warren exhaled sharply and pulled the door wide. The first wolf hesitated, as if expecting a trap. Then, weakly, it stepped inside. The second followed, moving with the careful grace of an animal on the edge of collapse. As soon as they felt the heat from the fire, they stopped. Their bodies shuddered violently as warmth seeped into their frozen bones. Warren slowly shut the door behind them, sealing them all in together. For a long moment, neither man nor beast moved. The only sound was the pop of the burning wood. The first wolf, larger, with a jagged scar running along its muzzle, shifted its weight. It didn't bare its teeth or lunge. It just watched him. The second, a bit smaller, collapsed almost immediately onto the wooden floor, exhausted beyond measure. That's when Warren noticed. The limp, its right hind leg was swollen, the fur stiff with dried blood, an injury, an old one, from the looks of it. These wolves weren't hunting. They were running. Warren exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Why? What drove them to my door? A rogue pack? A worse predator? Something about this felt off. But right now they needed help more than answers. Moving carefully, Warren backed toward the fireplace. He reached for another log, tossing it into the flames. The sudden burst of light made the wolves flinch but not retreat. Good. They weren't completely feral. Then food. He rummaged through his small pantry, pulling out a chunk of raw meat from his own supply. Hesitation flickered in his mind. Was this a mistake? Would feeding them make them see him as prey, instead of a refuge? He placed the meat on the floor and stepped back. For a long second, nothing happened. Then the smaller wolf, the injured one, dragged itself forward. It sniffed the offering once, then devoured it in 3 desperate bites. The larger wolf followed, more cautious but equally starved. When the meal was gone, they both lifted their heads toward him, watching, waiting. For what? Something about that look sent a ripple through Warren's gut. He'd seen fear in animals before. But this was something else. These wolves weren't just cold. They weren't just hungry. They were afraid. Of what? Or worse, of who? The cabin felt smaller with the 2 wolves inside. Warren's pulse still hadn't settled, every instinct telling him he was making a mistake. And yet, as he watched the animals huddled near the fire, their bodies slowly unwinding from the tight coil of survival, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was exactly where they needed to be. The injured one lay curled near the hearth, still trembling despite the warmth. The larger wolf sat more rigidly, muscles coiled, eyes flicking from Warren to the door, as if expecting something or someone to come crashing through. That unease clawed at Warren's gut. Why did they come here? He had seen wolves before, from a distance. He respected them, admired their strength. But they avoided humans. They feared fire, the scent of man. And yet these two had shown up at his doorstep, seeking shelter, seeking him. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the window panes. Warren grabbed his rifle from its place above the mantel and checked the chamber, loaded, safety on. He didn't like having a gun in the house when there were already two predators inside, but something about this situation felt off. If the wolves had run from something, he needed to be ready. He moved toward the smaller wolf, crouching carefully. The animal's flanks rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The band of dried blood around its leg looked worse in the firelight. Warren had enough experience with injuries on himself, on the occasional injured stray, to know infection was a real threat. Slowly, he reached out. The larger wolf let out a deep, warning growl. Warren froze. His heart slammed in his chest, but he held his ground, keeping his eyes low, non-threatening. "Easy," he murmured. "I just want to help." The bigger wolf didn't move, but its ears flicked forward, listening. Warren took the risk. He extended his hand again and gently touched the injured wolf's leg. The animal flinched but didn't snap. A good sign. Warren ran his fingers over the wound, feeling for broken bones, deep lacerations, anything beyond his ability to fix. It was swollen, tender but not shattered. Probably a sprain, maybe a deep cut. Treatable. He sat back on his heels thinking he had some old medical supplies, not meant for animals but better than nothing. As he stood, the larger wolf followed his movement with keen eyes, its body tense but not aggressive. "I'll get something for your friend," Warren said, more to himself than the wolves. "Stay put." He moved to the back room where he kept his first aid kit. The second he stepped away, the larger wolf rose and padded after him. Warren stopped, turned. The wolf stopped too, a silent standoff. Then the animal looked past him, toward the window. Its ears twitched. Its eyes locked onto something beyond the frost-covered glass. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the cabin. Warren's skin prickled. Slowly, he turned his head. Nothing. Just the dark, snow-covered forest beyond the glass. The storm swirling in slow, shifting waves. He exhaled. Just paranoia. The wind, the shadows. Then a sound. Not from inside. From out there. Crunch. A footstep. Warren's stomach dropped. The wolf let out a quiet whine, its body lowering instinctively. Something was out there. And it wasn't an animal. Warren moved slowly, placing his first aid kit on the table without a sound. His fingers inched toward the rifle. He grabbed it, flipping the safety off with a quiet click. For a long moment, the world held still. Then another step, this time closer. Warren's heart pounded against his ribs. He took a step toward the door, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. The wolf followed, its breath coming in slow, controlled exhales. Warren pressed his eye to the peephole. Darkness. Then a shadow moved, right at the edge of his porch. His grip tightened on the rifle. His mind raced. He lived in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor was miles away. No one just stumbled out here by accident. Another step. Something was right outside. Warren swallowed hard, adrenaline coursing through him. If this was a lost traveler, why not call out? If it was a scavenger, why not run when they heard the wolves? The presence outside his cabin lingered, waiting. The larger wolf let out a guttural growl, the hair on its back standing on end. Warren moved to the door, took a deep breath, and flung it open. Nothing. Empty snow. The dark outline of the forest, the wind whipping through the trees. He stepped onto the porch, gun raised, scanning the tree line. The wolves didn't move from inside, but their eyes were locked onto the same spot. Warren turned his flashlight toward the ground. Tracks, not paw prints, boot prints, leading straight to his door, and then disappearing. Warren's blood ran cold. Someone had been here. Someone had stood at his front door, listening, watching, and now they were gone. Warren's pulse hammered in his ears as he crouched. rifle still raised, studying the boot prints leading up to his door. Fresh, too fresh. Whoever had been here was just standing outside his cabin, watching, waiting, and then, gone. He swept his flashlight across the snow, searching for more tracks, some sign of which way they went. But as he moved beyond the porch, an eerie realization settled over him. The boot prints led to his door, but there were no tracks leading away. A chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan wind slithered down his spine. That wasn't possible. Even in heavy snowfall, tracks didn't just vanish. There should have been a trail leading back into the forest. But there was nothing. Warren took another step forward, his breath curling in the freezing air. His flashlight beam cut through the swirling snowflakes, scanning the tree line, the open stretches of white. Silence. Nothing but the howling wind and the endless suffocating cold. His grip on the rifle tightened. The wolves hadn't moved from inside. The larger one stood at the threshold, staring into the dark, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. The smaller one, still too weak to stand, let out a soft, uneasy whine. Warren turned back toward the porch, something deep in his gut urging him to get inside. Lock the doors. Secure the windows. This wasn't just some lost hiker, and if it was, then why the hell didn't they knock? Why stand there in silence, leaving no trace of where they went? A noise, soft, a whisper against the wind. Not a human voice, not an animal, something else. Warren froze. It came from the tree line, barely audible, like the sound of fabric brushing against itself. A shift in weight on the frozen ground. A presence. He turned sharply, flashlight beam sweeping across the trees. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, he saw it. A figure, tall, wrapped in heavy dark clothing, standing between the trees, watching him. The light barely reached its face, but Warren caught the glint of eyes. Cold, motionless. And then, it stepped back, melted into the shadows, gone. Warren didn't hesitate. He pivoted, sprinting up the steps, slamming the cabin door shut behind him. He flipped the locks, bolted the deadbolt, and backed away, rifle still raised. The wolves hadn't moved. The bigger one stood rigid, its ears twitching toward the door. The smaller one breathed heavy, its sides rising and falling too quickly. Warren's mind raced. Who was that? A poacher? A lost traveler? Or something worse? His cabin was miles from civilization. There were no roads leading here. No reason for anyone to be in this part of the wilderness unless they were looking for something. Or someone. His stomach twisted. The wolves, had they been running from whoever that was? He thought back to the way they had arrived. Desperate, exhausted, terrified. The way the larger one had watched the door all night, waiting. They weren't just seeking shelter from the cold. They were hiding from something or someone. Warren forced himself to breathe. He needed a plan. Staying put was the safest option. For now. But if this person was dangerous, if they had tracked the wolves all the way here, they weren't just going to leave. They'd be back. Warren moved through the cabin quickly, checking the windows, reinforcing the locks. He pulled down the thick blinds, double-checked his emergency supplies. Enough food and water for a few weeks, ammo for the rifle, backup batteries for the radio. He wasn't paranoid. He was prepared. Living out here, you had to be. But as he secured the last window, he caught movement outside. Not in the tree line. Closer, right at the edge of his porch. A single boot print, pressed deep into the snow. New, right where he had just been standing. His pulse roared in his ears. Whoever was out there, they weren't gone. They were circling, waiting. Warren took a step back, heart hammering. The wolves watched him, their eyes sharp, ears pricked. Then the larger wolf did something that made Warren's breath hitch. It turned away from the door and looked up. Its gaze locked onto the ceiling, and it growled. A deep, primal warning. Warren's stomach lurched. He followed the wolf's gaze, and his blood ran cold, soft, almost imperceptible. Above him, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps on the roof. Warren's breath locked in his chest. The wolf's growl rumbled low, primal, its hackles raised as it stared at the ceiling. Above them, the The sound came again. A single, deliberate step, then another. Warren's grip on the rifle tightened, his knuckles bone-white. His mind screamed against logic. No one should be up there. His cabin's roof was steep, covered in ice, nearly impossible to climb in this weather. And yet, someone was up there, moving, slowly, deliberately. Warren inched back toward the fireplace, where his emergency lantern flickered against the log walls. Shadows danced wildly across the room, stretching and twisting like specters. The larger wolf stayed rigid, a living statue of muscle and tension. The smaller one trembled where it lay, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. Then, a sharp thud, right above his head. A surge of adrenaline exploded through Warren's veins. His instincts screamed two things at once. Move, but don't make a sound. He swallowed hard, forcing his breath into slow, quiet exhales. What was this? A poacher? Some drifter? Or was it something worse? The Alaskan wilderness was filled with stories. Strange stories. Things that couldn't be explained. Warren never put much stock in them. He was a man of reality. Tangible things. Things you could see and touch and fight if necessary. But this was different. His eyes flicked toward the boarded-up attic hatch in the far corner of the room. It led up to the rafters, right beneath the roof. If they were on the roof, what was stopping them from coming inside? A horrible thought gripped his chest. What if they already had? He turned sharply, scanning the room, checking every darkened corner, every shadowed recess. The wolves reacted to the movement, their eyes darting in sync with his. There was nothing. Only the wind howling outside, the pounding of his own heartbeat, and then, silence. The footsteps stopped. The larger wolf lifted its head, sniffing the air. Its growl softened into a low whimper. Confused. Had they left? Warren strained his ears, listening. Not a sound, just the wind. The faint crackle of the fire. He exhaled slowly, his muscles burning from the tension. Maybe they were gone. Maybe. Crack. The sound split through the air like a gunshot. Not from the roof, from outside. A sharp, splintering crack, like ice breaking under weight. Warren's blood ran cold. He rushed to the window, careful not to touch the curtains, keeping himself hidden. The wolves shifted beside him, their ears twitching. The larger one let out a low, uneasy whine. Outside, just beyond his porch, the world was an expanse of white. The snowfall had stopped, leaving everything eerily still. And then, he saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line. A dark silhouette against the snow, unmoving, watching. Even at this distance, Warren could tell they weren't bundled up like someone braving the elements. Their posture was too relaxed, their stance too steady for someone fighting the cold. Something was wrong. Deeply, deeply wrong. Then, before Warren could process what he was seeing, the figure moved. Not toward the cabin, not away, but to the side, slipping seamlessly into the trees, vanishing, like they had never been there at all. Warren's skin crawled. He turned away from the window, pulse roaring in his ears. Whoever they weren't just lost. They were hunting, and whatever they wanted, it wasn't over yet. The wolves felt it too. The larger one let out another deep, unsettling growl. The smaller one, still too weak to stand, let out a sharp, urgent whimper. Warren took a slow, steady breath, gripping the rifle tighter. He needed to make a decision. Stay locked inside, or confront whoever or whatever was out there before they made the next move. Neither option felt safe. But one thing was certain. This night wasn't going to end peacefully. Warren's grip on the rifle tightened, his pulse pounding in his ears. His breath came slow, controlled, instinct taking over. The wolves sensed it too. The larger one, still bristling with tension, stood protectively over its injured sibling. Its ears twitched at every small sound. Its muscles coiled like a loaded spring. The smaller one let out a soft whimper, too weak to move, but aware that something was very, very wrong. The figure in the woods had disappeared, but Warren knew better. They were still out there, watching, waiting. He took a slow step back from the window, careful not to make a sound. His boots barely creaked against the wooden floor, but even that seemed too loud in the thick silence. His gut screamed at him. You need to act before they do. But how? What kind of person or thing stands in sub-zero temperatures in the dead of night, without moving, without flinching? A sane man wouldn't, and a sane man wouldn't vanish like that, slipping into the trees without so much as a sound. Warren took another step back, pressing his shoulder against the cabin wall. His mind ran through possibilities. A poacher. No poachers hunted animals, not men. A lost traveler. Doubtful. No footprints led to the cabin, only a way. Something else. Something worse. He exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. Think. You know this land better than anyone. If someone was out there, they had two options: circle the cabin and test for weaknesses, or retreat and return. When Warren let his guard down, neither was good. He turned to the wolves. The larger one was still fixated on the door, every hair on its body standing on end. If it thought the real danger was still outside, that meant they hadn't made their move yet. Warren exhaled slowly, barely a whisper in the still air. Then it's my move first. He crossed the room in near silence, grabbing his heavy coat from the peg by the door. He slipped into his thickest boots, then reached for his hatchet, securing it at his hip. The rifle was already loaded. The wolf's eyes followed his every movement. He knelt beside the larger one, meeting its gaze. You stay here, he murmured. Protect her. The wolf's ears flicked forward, understanding in its intelligent eyes. Then without another word, Warren pulled open the door and stepped outside. The cold hit like a hammer. The temperature had dropped further, the air so bitter it burned his throat. The storm had passed, leaving behind a night sky filled with stars, sharp and unblinking, their light reflecting off the snow. Everything was still. Too still. Warren lifted the rifle, scanning the tree line. No movement, no sound, just the whisper of the wind weaving through the pines. He took a careful step forward, boots crunching against the frozen ground. His breath formed a thick mist, curling in the frigid air. He followed the footprints, the ones leading away from the cabin. His gut twisted with unease. They weren't deep. Whoever or whatever had been standing out here had barely left a trace, as if they were too light for the snow to hold. That wasn't right. A grown man, especially bundled for winter, should have left deeper imprints. Heavy, uneven. But these, they were shallow, almost deliberate. Warren's grip tightened around the rifle. Then he noticed something worse. There were no prints leading in. His stomach lurched. The tracks only led away from the cabin. No sign of approach, no disturbance in the fresh snowfall, like they had appeared out of nowhere. His breath turned to ice in his lungs. Then a sound. A whispering shift in the wind. Behind him, Warren whipped around. Nothing, just the empty clearing. His cabin stood a few yards away, warm light flickering in the windows. The door remained open, the wolves still watching him from inside. Had it been his imagination, or was something playing with him? His instincts screamed, get back inside, now. But his pride, his stubborn, stupid pride, kept him rooted in place. He forced himself to step further into the trees. The forest swallowed him instantly, the towering pines closing in overhead. The deeper he went, the more the light from the cabin faded, until only the silver glow of the moon illuminated the landscape. Then another sound, this time clearer. A soft crunch of snow, not his own. Something else was moving, just ahead. He raised the rifle, the barrel steady despite the ice in his veins. A shadow shifted between the trees. His pulse thundered. It wasn't the figure from before. It was something else, lower to the ground, moving silently despite the thick snow. A wolf? No. The shape was wrong. His fingers tightened around the trigger. Show yourself, he said, voice low and firm. Nothing. Just the whispering wind. Then a breath, right behind him. Warren spun, raising the rifle, but there was nothing. No tracks, no movement, nothing. Just the suffocating, endless quiet of the woods. His blood turned to ice. He was being hunted, not by an animal, not by a man, by something else. The wolves had known. They had sensed it first, and now Warren understood why they had been so afraid. He needed to get back to the cabin. Now, he turned sharply, retracing his steps, keeping his pace slow, controlled. He didn't run, not yet. Running meant panic. Panic meant mistakes. And it was still out there, watching, waiting. He stepped back into the clearing, the warm glow of the cabin in sight. He exhaled, almost relieved. Then something moved, directly inside the cabin. His stomach dropped. The larger wolf was snarling now, its body rigid, but not at him, at something inside, something he hadn't let in. Warren's breath hitched, his body locked up. The rifle in his hands felt heavier than ever. Something was inside the cabin. The warm glow from the fireplace flickered, casting eerie shadows against the wooden walls. The larger wolf stood rigid, every muscle tensed, its ears flattened against its skull. It wasn't looking at Warren, it was looking past him, straight at something inside the house. Warren's mind raced. Had someone slipped in while he was outside? A drifter? A scavenger? No, that didn't make sense. He had only been gone minutes. The cabin was a single room. He would have seen them. He would have heard them. And yet, something was in there. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from the wolf's chest. Its lips curled, exposing sharp fangs. The smaller wolf, still weak from its injury, let out a whimper, shrinking closer to the ground. Warren took a slow step forward, eyes locked on the doorway. The rifle stayed raised, finger hovering over the trigger. His pulse pounded in his ears. The fire crackled inside, but everything else was silent. Too silent. Something waited just beyond the threshold. Inside his home, he inhaled sharply, then moved. In one fluid motion, he stormed through the door, rifle raised. Nothing. The cabin was empty. The door creaked as it swung inward. The warm air hit his face, thawing the cold that had settled into his bones. But something was off. His gut screamed at him. Something had been here. Something had stepped inside. He scanned the room. The furniture was untouched. The supplies still stacked where he left them. But then his eyes landed on the floor, and his blood turned to ice. There were no tracks, no footprints in the snow leading inside, no signs of entry. But the wolves had seen something. The larger wolf remained at the doorway, its growl deep and unrelenting, its amber eyes locked onto the empty space near the fireplace. Warren followed its gaze. The fire flickered, flames dancing wildly, too wildly, as if disturbed by a presence unseen. His fingers tightened on the rifle. His breath was slow, deliberate. Then a sound, a whisper, soft, distant, right behind him. Warren whipped around, but there was nothing, just the open doorway leading back to the frozen night. The wind howled outside, but inside, everything remained still, except for the wolves. They felt it. They knew. Warren swallowed hard. He wasn't about to second-guess his own instincts. Something had entered this cabin, and whatever it was, it didn't leave. The waiting game minutes passed. Then an hour. Warren didn't move from his chair by the fire. His rifle rested across his lap, but his grip never loosened. The wolves remained close. The larger one paced occasionally, ears twitching at every creak of the wooden beams. The smaller one still lay weak, but kept its gaze locked toward the same empty space. The room felt wrong, off balance. It wasn't just paranoia. The air was different, thicker, heavy with something he couldn't name. Warren had lived in these woods long enough to know when something wasn't right. And this was not right. He glanced at the door again, still shut, locked. Nothing had come in, nothing had left, so why did it feel like he wasn't alone? His stomach twisted, his skin prickled with unseen eyes. Then the fire dimmed, just slightly, just enough for the shadows in the cabin to stretch, to shift. The wolves snapped to attention. The larger one let out a sharp bark, stepping in front of Warren protectively. The smaller wolf, weak as it was, tried to stand but collapsed, whining. Warren's hands tightened around the rifle. The fire sputtered again. The shadows moved. And this time Warren saw it. A flicker, a shape, a disturbance in the air. Not solid, not quite there. Like something was trying to manifest. his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a person. This wasn't an animal. This was something else, something ancient, something that had been here long before him. The realization struck him like a hammer. He had taken in the wolves. He had offered them warmth, shelter, and in doing so, he had invited something else in, something that had been hunting them, something that now had its sights on him. Warren's pulse pounded. He raised the rifle, aiming at the shifting shadows. Then, a whisper. Not from outside, not from behind him, but from inside his own head. Low, murmuring, indistinct, like wind moving through the trees, but with words he couldn't understand. He was not supposed to be here. A shiver ran through his body. The wolves were still growling, their hackles raised. The firelight flickered again, and the shape moved. Warren fired. The gunshot shattered the silence. The cabin filled with smoke, the scent of burnt gunpowder stinging his nostrils. The wolves barked, startled by the blast. But when the smoke cleared, nothing. The shadows were still. The fire burned steady again. The air was quiet. Had it been real? Or had it been something else? Something the mind wasn't meant to see. Warren's pulse still thundered in his ears. He lowered the rifle, swallowing hard. Then, carefully, he turned to the wolves. They were watching him, not afraid, not panicked, just watching. Like they understood what had just happened. Like they had seen it too. Warren exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He had no idea what was happening, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about wolves anymore. Something else was at play, and whatever it wasn't done with him yet. Warren sat in silence, his breath heavy, his pulse still racing. The cabin had returned to an eerie stillness, as if nothing had happened, but he knew better. The wolves knew better. They still sat alert, their bodies rigid, ears swiveling at the smallest creak of wood. Their instincts told them something unnatural had entered their space. Warren had seen it, felt it, and now an overwhelming realization settled in his chest. This wasn't over. His grip on the rifle was tight, his knuckles turning white. He had fired at something that shouldn't exist, and yet the bullet had hit nothing. His logical mind wanted to dismiss it. Maybe exhaustion, maybe stress, but his gut knew the truth. Something was out there, and it was waiting. The larger wolf let out a sharp huff, pacing near the door. It paused, sniffing the air. A low guttural growl rumbled from deep in its chest. It could smell it. Warren clenched his jaw. If the wolves were still sensing something, then whatever had appeared was still nearby. His heart pounded as he moved to the window. The world outside was a frozen wasteland, illuminated only by the faint moonlight reflecting off the snow. The storm had passed, leaving an unsettling stillness. But then, a movement, a flicker at the edge of the tree line, something shifting in the darkness. Warren's fingers curled tighter around the rifle. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't imagining things. Something was watching him. He turned back to the wolves. They were both staring at him now, as if waiting for his next move. The smaller one, though still weak, let out a soft whimper, nudging against its sibling. A sudden thought crossed Warren's mind. The wolves had come to him for protection. But from what? Had they been running from this thing? Had they led it straight to his doorstep? He swallowed hard, his throat dry. Whatever it wasn't going to leave on its own. He had two choices: stay inside and wait for it to make a move, or go out and confront it. His instincts screamed at him to choose the first option, to stay where there was warmth and protection. But the wolves were still restless, still uneasy. They knew something was coming, and Warren wasn't about to sit around and wait for it to strike first. Into the night, his boots crunched against the frozen ground as he stepped outside. The cold air hit him like a wall, biting into his skin. His breath came out in thick clouds, hanging in the air before fading into the darkness. The wolves hesitated at the threshold, but the larger one followed, its body low and alert. The smaller one remained inside, too weak to keep up. Warren took slow, measured steps. The rifle stayed steady in his hands, his eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The silence was suffocating. Then, a sound, low, deep, a growl, but it didn't come from the wolf at his side. It came from the trees. Warren's grip on the rifle tightened. His instincts screamed, "Run, run," but he stood his ground. The wolf beside him lowered its head, teeth bared, its ears flattened, muscles tensed. It saw it too. A shadow moved between the trees, not walking, not running, gliding. Warren's breath hitched. The shape was wrong. Its limbs too long, its movement too smooth. It was watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck rose. His body screamed at him to retreat, to turn back. Then, it stepped forward, and the world seemed to stop. The moonlight caught its shape, revealing a figure not quite animal, not quite human. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were gaunt, stretched unnaturally, its fingers ending in razor-sharp points. Glowing eyes, pierced the darkness, and then it smiled. A mouth full of jagged teeth, a sound low, guttural, inhuman, slithered from its throat. The wolf beside Warren let out a vicious snarl, stepping in front of him. A protector, a challenge. Warren's mind was screaming, trying to comprehend what he was seeing. This was no ordinary predator. This was something old, something that belonged to the wilderness before men ever set foot here. Something that should have never been disturbed. His heart thundered. He had seconds to react. The thing moved. Fast. Too fast. 1 second, it was at the tree line. The next, it was right in front of him. Warren fired. The gunshot shattered the night. The wolf lunged. The figure vanished. Gone. Like it had never been there. But Warren wasn't fooled. He could still feel it. Watching. Waiting. The wolf at his side was still snarling. Its fur bristled. Its instincts hadn't eased. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Warren took a shaky breath, backing toward the cabin. He wasn't dealing with something natural, and the worst part, he had no idea how to fight it. Warren's heartbeat pounded in his ears as he took slow, careful steps backward toward the cabin. His fingers curled tightly around the rifle, his knuckles white. The wolf beside him stood rigid, its teeth bared, fur standing on end. Its growls were low and continuous. A warning, a challenge. But the thing in the woods, it didn't move. It didn't react. It just stood there, watching. Its glowing eyes locked onto Warren's, unblinking. The sickening grin remained carved onto its gaunt face, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. It was playing with him, testing him. The air between them felt electric, thick with something unnatural. Warren swallowed hard. His gut screamed at him to run, to get inside and bar the door. But he knew better. Predators didn't chase prey that stood its ground. They hunted the weak, the afraid. And he wasn't about to give it the satisfaction. Slowly he raised the rifle again, steadying his aim. His breath was controlled, his stance firm. The thing tilted its head, mocking him, challenging him. And then, it took a step forward. The wolf beside Warren lunged without hesitation, snapping its powerful jaws with a ferocity Warren had never seen before. Its deep, guttural snarl tore through the night like a war cry. Warren pulled the trigger. Bang! The shot rang out, echoing through the trees. But just like before, the thing was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. The wolf snarled again, whipping its head around, its nose in the air, searching. Its golden eyes flickered wildly, scanning every shadow, every movement. Warren did the same. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. His pulse thundered. He turned in slow circles, scanning the darkness, the endless expanse of trees. Where did it go? Where was it hiding? The silence that followed was deafening. The trees swayed gently in the wind. The snow crunched beneath Warren's boots as he shifted his weight. But there was no movement, no sign of the thing. And yet, he could still feel it, still sense it. It was here, somewhere, waiting, watching. His breathing hitched. He had spent years in the wilderness, learning its rhythm, understanding its hidden dangers. He knew how to track, how to hunt, how to survive. But this was different. This wasn't something he could outthink. This wasn't something he could fight. He needed to get back inside. Now, he turned to the wolf. Its ears twitched, its body still coiled with tension. "Come on," Warren whispered, barely more than a breath. Inside, the wolf hesitated. It didn't want to retreat. It wanted to fight. But Warren wasn't about to give it a choice. He moved, slow but steady, toward the cabin, never taking his eyes off the tree line. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to keep his grip firm. One step, then another. The wolf backed up with him, its growls quieting just enough to listen. They were almost at the door when a sound, not a growl, not a rustle, a laugh, low, raspy, wrong. It slithered through the air, curling around him like a vice. Warren froze. The wolf did too, ears pinned back, tail rigid. The laugh came again, this time closer. And then, bang, a second gunshot exploded through the night. But this one didn't come from Warren. Someone else had fired. The arrival. Warren whipped around, his pulse hammering. The sound had come from the other side of the cabin, deeper in the woods. He wasn't alone. The wolf's head snapped toward the same direction, nostrils flaring. It let out another snarl, but this time there was hesitation, uncertainty. Warren's mind raced. Who else was out here? Was it a hunter? A ranger? Or had someone else been tracking this thing? A light flickered through the trees. A flashlight. Someone was moving toward him. Warren tensed, rifle still raised. His instincts screamed at him to be ready for anything. Then, a voice. Warren. A woman. His stomach dropped. Kara. She stepped into view, bundled in thick winter gear, her breath rising in clouds of mist. A rifle was slung across her shoulder, and her face was set in grim determination. "What the hell is going on?" she demanded. For a moment, Warren couldn't speak. His mind was still tangled in the shock, the fear, the pure madness of what he had just witnessed. But then he saw it in her eyes. She knew, she had seen something too. "You fired a shot," Warren finally said, voice hoarse. "Did you see it?" Kara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she scanned the trees, her grip on her rifle tightening. "I don't know what I saw," she admitted, "but I know it wasn't human." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Warren's spine. Kara looked at the wolf beside him, then at the cabin. Inside. Now, Warren didn't argue. They both rushed through the door, the wolf following, but still lingering at the entrance, watching, waiting. Kara slammed the door shut behind them, locking it tight. Then she turned to Warren, her eyes blazing. "Start talking. The truth unfolds." Warren exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He still felt like his body was running on adrenaline, his nerves raw. He told her everything. The wolves arriving at his door, their strange behavior, the thing that had followed them, the laughter, the way it disappeared into thin air. Kara listened, her expression unreadable. But as he spoke, she slowly sank into a chair, rubbing her temples. "I knew something was wrong," she muttered. Warren frowned. "What do you mean?" She looked up, jaw tight. "The wolves, we've been tracking their pack for months." She hesitated, then shook her head. "Something's been picking them off." Warren's stomach clenched. Picking them off. Kara nodded. "They weren't just wandering or lost, Warren. They were running from something." His blood ran cold. She continued. "We found tracks, wolf tracks. But sometimes, we found something else mixed in with them. Something bigger. Something we couldn't identify." She met his eyes, and in that moment he saw the same fear that had been gripping him for days. "You're telling me these wolves led that thing here?" he asked, voice low. Kara shook her head. "No," she whispered. "They weren't leading it." She swallowed. "They were hiding from it." Silence. Heavy. Crushing. The wolf at the door let out a low, cautious growl. Warren barely breathed. Then, a knock. At the door. Slow. Rhythmic. Warren and Kara both went rigid, their eyes locked on the wooden frame. Another knock. Then, a voice. Low. Slithering. "Not human. Let me in." Warren's breath caught in his throat. The voice wasn't right. It had a human cadence, a familiar structure. But there was something off. Something hollow. Something that crawled under his skin like ice water. Knock. 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 The sound was almost playful. The wolf by the door let out a guttural snarl, its hackles raised. It took a slow step forward, lips curled back in a vicious primal warning. Warren locked eyes with Kara. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. Another knock. This time louder, more insistent. And then that voice again. "Let me in, Warren." His stomach turned to stone. It knew his name. His hands clenched into fists. His knuckles bone white. Kara mouthed something to him, but he couldn't process it. His mind was spinning, spiraling, screaming at him to do something, to move, to react. But he was frozen, staring at the door, waiting for it to break open. And then, silence. The knocks stopped. The air thickened with stillness, pressing down on them like a physical weight. The wolf's growl rumbled deep in its chest, ears twitching, nostrils flaring, searching. Kara finally whispered, "Is it gone?" Warren shook his head. He knew better. It wasn't gone. It was just waiting. The watcher and the snow minutes passed. Then an hour. They didn't move, didn't speak. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did nothing to chase away the cold creeping into Warren's bones. At some point, the wolf moved away from the door, but it didn't relax. It paced, restless, occasionally glancing toward the frost-coated window. Warren risked a glance too. The snow outside stretched undisturbed, the tree line a jagged silhouette against the black sky. No tracks, no sign of movement, nothing, but he could feel it, the presence. It was still there, still watching, still waiting. Kara exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. "I don't like this, Warren." He let out a humorless breath. "You think I do?" She shook her head. "No, I think you're as terrified as I am." He didn't argue, because she was right. They sat there in tense silence, the weight of something unseen pressing down on them. The wolf eventually lay down near the fire, its muscles still taut, still ready. The hours crawled forward. Nothing happened. Not another knock. Not another voice. Not a single shift in the frozen world outside. And that was somehow worse. Because now, it wasn't playing games. Now it was hunting. A faint howl in the dark, sometime deep into the night. Just when Warren's eyelids were growing heavy, the wolf suddenly shot up. Its ears perked, its body tensed. And then it howled, low and deep, a sound that sent shivers down Warren's spine. He jolted awake fully, gripping the arms of his chair. Kara's head snapped up too. "What is it?" But she didn't need an answer, because then they heard it. From far, far beyond the trees, another howl. Faint, weak, but undeniably real. Kara's expression shifted instantly. Another wolf. Warren's pulse thundered. His mind raced. Another wolf. Could it be part of their pack? The injured one's sibling? Or something else entirely? The larger wolf by the fire let out another, responding howl. Louder this time. More urgent. Then it ran to the door, scratching, pawing, wanting out. Kara stood quickly. "Warren, we need to..." But before she could finish, the door burst open. The blizzard's curse. The wind screamed through the open doorway. Snow and ice blasted into the cabin like a living thing, forcing Warren and Kara to shield their faces. The wolf bolted out, gone into the night, swallowed by the blizzard. Warren cursed and lunged for the rifle. Kara grabbed his arm. "Wait, don't." But he wasn't thinking. He wasn't planning. He was moving. The door had already been opened. The wolves were running, and if he didn't act now, he would lose them forever. Without another word, Warren rushed into the storm, lost in the white abyss. The cold hit him like a sledgehammer. It was so much worse than before. The blizzard had thickened into a swirling mass of white, cutting visibility down to nearly nothing. He could barely see his own hands. The snow swallowed sound, absorbed movement, made everything feel disorienting. But Warren kept running. His boots crunched against the ice. His breath came in short gasps. He had to find them. The wolves, the thing, the truth. Somewhere ahead, a shadow moved. Warren froze. His fingers tightened on the rifle. "Kara," he called, but the wind stole his voice. Then another shadow, closer. His pulse roared. And then, the whisper came, right beside his ear. "So close. You shouldn't have come outside, Warren." His blood turned to ice. He spun, rifle raised, but nothing was there. The wind howled. The storm raged. and Warren realized he was completely, utterly alone. The eyes in the blizzard, the snow shifted, something moved in the white. A figure, tall, lurking, watching. Warren's grip on the rifle was slick with sweat despite the freezing cold. His breath came out in heavy bursts, his chest tight with panic. Then a pair of eyes blinked open in the storm. Not animal, not human. Something else, something ancient, something that did not belong. The laughter came again, low, raspy, crawling into his bones. It was right in front of him. A desperate choice. Warren didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't even breathe. He fired. The gunshot cracked through the blizzard, a deafening explosion against the quiet suffocation of the snow. The figure jerked, then it screamed, a sound that was not human, not of this world, not of anything Warren had ever heard before. The force of it knocked him back. He hit the ground hard, pain lancing up his spine, but he didn't stop. He scrambled, crawled, gripping at the snow as if it could save him. And then, through the chaos, through the storm, through the madness, he saw them, the wolves standing together, and beyond them, Kara, reaching for him, screaming his name. Warren, run. And then, the darkness swallowed everything. The world collapsed into chaos. The blizzard shrieked like a living thing, its icy claws tearing through the air, swallowing every sound, every movement, every trace of sanity. Warren's body screamed in pain as he staggered to his feet, vision blurred, heart hammering against his ribs like a frantic drum. But there was no time to think, no time to process. The thing was still here, still moving, still watching. Somewhere in the storm, its presence loomed like a shadow without form, everywhere and nowhere at once. The wolves stood between him and it, their bodies tense, their eyes locked onto the unseen horror shifting in the snow. And then, it spoke, not with a voice, not with sound, but with something deeper, something inside him, a whisper that slithered through his veins, coiling around his thoughts, twisting into his mind like poison. You are not meant to be here, Warren. His stomach turned to stone. It knew his name. Again, like before, like the knock at the door, like the laughter in the wind. But this time, it was inside him, digging, pulling, trying to undo him. The wolves' fury. The first attack came like a ripple through the snow, a force unseen, but felt. The ground lurched. The air shifted. The wolves reacted first. A snarl ripped through the storm as the largest of them lunged, fangs bared, muscles coiled, a force of nature meeting the unknown head-on. Warren barely had time to register what was happening before the smaller wolf followed, its injured leg forgotten, its instincts overtaking all else. They weren't just fighting, they were protecting him. The thing screamed, not a sound, a feeling, a ripple in reality, a rupture in the air. The wolves clashed with it, but there was nothing to see, only shapes, only movement, only the gut-wrenching sense that something was being torn apart. And Warren knew this was their fight, not his. If he didn't move now, if he didn't run, if he didn't break free, he would be lost forever. Kara's final plea. Then, a hand grabbing him, pulling him. Kara, her eyes wild with terror. She was screaming, but her voice barely broke through the storm. Warren, we have to go. But he couldn't. He couldn't leave them. The wolves, they were still fighting, still holding the line. But something was wrong. The smaller wolf stumbled, a choked whimper escaping its throat. As the storm seemed to press in around it, it was losing. It was dying. No, no. Warren wouldn't allow it. Not after everything. Not after all they'd done. Not after all they'd been through together. And so, he did the only thing he could. He ran toward the fight. The breaking point. Kara's scream tore through the night, as Warren threw himself forward, into the storm, into the nightmare, into the unknown. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't fear. All he knew was that the wolves, his wolves, needed him. And if this was the end, if this was how it all fell apart, then he would fall with them. But then, something changed. The second he touched the smaller wolf, the second his hands gripped its trembling body, the second he became part of the fight, the thing lurched back, as if burned, as if recoiling, as if Warren's presence itself was a wound in its reality. And then he understood. It wasn't the wolves that were keeping the thing at bay. It was him. It had never wanted the wolves. It had wanted him. It had been calling him, waiting for him, hunting him. And now he had broken the rules. He had interfered, and the thing was afraid. The wolves' final act. The largest wolf seized the moment. With a final thunderous howl, it attacked. Warren felt the air shatter, felt the storm break apart, felt the thing recoil, and then, it was gone. The wind died, the cold stilled, and the wolves collapsed. A promise in the snow. The silence was deafening, the world white and unmoving. Kara was beside him in an instant, helping him lift the smaller wolf, checking its wound, her hands shaking as she muttered desperate reassurances. But the larger wolf, it was still. Warren's chest tightened. He crawled to its side, hands trembling, breath caught somewhere between a sob and a prayer. The wolf's eyes met his, and for a moment, just a moment, Warren swore it smiled. Then, with one final exhale, it closed its eyes, and was gone. Warren's breath hitched. His fingers curled into the wolf's thick fur, holding on, as if sheer willpower could pull it back. But it was too late. Too late. And yet, as the sun began to rise, as the sky bled from black to silver to gold, as the first light of morning bathed the world in warmth, Warren swore he heard it. A final distant howl, carried on the wind. And though his heart ached, though his chest felt heavy, though he knew a part of him would never quite be the same, he smiled, because he understood. The wolf had never truly left, not in spirit, not in memory, not in the bond they had forged. It had given its life to protect him, and now, it would live on, in the wild, in the snow, and in him, forever. The journey home, they returned to the shelter in silence. The smaller wolf was alive. It would heal, and when the time was right, it would be free again. Kara said nothing, but her eyes spoke volumes. As they loaded the wolf into the transport, as the truck rumbled to life, as the road stretched out ahead of them, Warren took one last look at the forest, at the place where it had all happened, where he had changed, and then, with a deep breath, he turned away, and went home. The legend lives on, some say. On the coldest nights, when the wind howls just right, you can still hear it. A lone echoing howl, drifting through the trees. A guardian, a protector, a wolf who gave everything for the one he chose to save. And if you listen closely, you might just hear it calling your name too. But if you do, don't answer, because some doors are never meant to be opened.